Recently, I read a book by Josephine Tay called The Daughter of Time.
Oh, yeah.
It's a novel. In fact, it's a detective story, and I read it as a detective story for pleasure. And then suddenly my mind was caught in a problem I never thought about before.
Yeah, I know.
The book presents a totally different theory about one of the great English kings, Richard III, than the one I was acquainted with from reading Shakespeare's play, Richard III, or reading the ordinary history books about Richard III, which make him out to be a villain.
Yeah.
Really quite a villain.
The crookback, Richard Crookback,
That's
with
right.
his hunchback and his villainous...
Even questionable whether he had a hunchback. And it's certainly, according to Josephine Tay, highly questionable whether he murdered the two princes who might have been heirs to the throne in the Tower. In fact, she amasses a great deal of evidence and very cogent arguments to show that it was not Richard III, but the first Tudor king, Henry VII, his rival in a sense, the man who made him abdicate or killed him, led to his assassination. Well, after all, I can't take Josephine Tay as a serious historian, and so what I would do is to read books on both sides of this question, look at the evidence amassed pro and con, and I would be in the best position to make my own mind up. Everyone has to make his own mind up at a question of this kind as to whether or not Richard III is the hunchback villain or the good king.
Right, and this would be a different kind of reading from any kind of reading we've been talking about
Absolutely.
before.
Because it's, you know, at the time that How to Read a Book was first published, some wag wanted to take the book off, wrote a book called How to Read Two Books. But that, in effect, that title, which was meant jocularly, is really quite serious, because the art of reading not just two books, but two or more books, a whole set of books on a given subject, is perhaps the highest reach of the whole business of reading.
You know, this is really fascinating, Mortimer, because you started out to spend an hour reading a detective story just for pleasure, and you find yourself undertaking the highest and most challenging level and kind of reading that there is, syntopical reading, as we call it, where you read many books on one subject in order to understand, to discover whether they agree or disagree.
At the Institute of Philosophical Research, for example, we produced, with a large staff of persons engaged in the work, these 2 volumes on the idea of freedom. That staff, men, women, read over 500 books about freedom, trying to discover whether the same subject is being discussed by all these books. In fact, they discovered there were 5 different subjects to which the word freedom was applied. And then for each of those subjects which they identified, they tried to find out whether the authors who wrote about that subject under the name of freedom agreed or disagreed, and why they disagreed, how they argued about the subject. And these 2 volumes are a kind of map, a kind of chart of the whole terrain of the controversy about freedom. This is a fine example of syntopical reading, and this book that you did also.
That's another one.
On the idea of progress, same method. You read a whole series of books, all dealing with the subject of progress, to find out what the range of opinion is, the lines, the patterns of agreement or disagreement, differences of opinion, and whether or not they all focus on one and the same subject or on several subjects. Right. It's a very engaging and exciting undertaking, but elaborate, almost always elaborate.
I was just considering the last item in this book, The Idea of Progress, is a 15-page bibliography. That's the last thing in the book and the last thing I wrote, but the first thing you do. Yeah. That's the first step that you take, is to gather the material.
Bibliography and The Idea of Freedom is 50 pages long.
Right, right.
Huge bibliography.
And then after you've decided or have a rough idea what the materials are, then you inspect them. You look at them very quickly. You don't read them right all the way through.
And you have to find the passages in different books that speak to the same point. Sort of, you do a kind of assembly of relevant passages, right, and relate them to a given point of reference.
Exactly, and then you have to come to terms, not with each individual book, but with the common terms in the whole discussion.
You discovered in looking at the whole literature on progress that some authors think that progress consists of going from less to more as progress of population increases. Okay. And some authors think that progress consists of going from worse to better. Right. Well, now, those are 2 different meanings of progress. Right. And if one author thinks that progress is quantitative, and the other thinks it's qualitative or ameliorative in the sense of worse to better, they're talking about different meanings, different things.
That's right. And then from then on, you have to read all of the authors that you've assembled here according to those common terms.
But even after you've done that, after you've found that a number of authors are talking about the same object, that they're using the crucial word applied to the same point of reference, the same object, it then becomes, I think, the most difficult step is to find out whether they agree or disagree, because they all use the language in their own way, And when you find that they disagree, you've got to find out, if you can, their reasons for disagreeing.
Right.
Let me give you an illustration of a very narrow case of syntopical reading that I've had some experience with. I'm going to take three authors on a subject. The subject is freedom. I mean, I'm going to, in other words, condense these two volumes into one simple illustration. I'm going to start out with an author a very interesting one, Jonathan Boucher, who was an Anglican divine, Anglican clergyman in 1775, who made a speech from a pulpit in Virginia, arguing that, of course, that the colony should not resist the rule of George III. In the course of this...
He had to have his pistols up on the pulpit.
That is correct.
He was afraid of what his parishioners would do to it.
In the course of this sermon, he defines liberty. He says, "True liberty, then, is a liberty to do everything that is right, and being restrained from doing anything that is wrong. So far from having a right to do everything that we please under a notion of liberty, liberty itself is limited and confined, but limited and confined only by laws which are at the same time both its foundation and its support." Okay. Now there's a meaning of liberty which says liberty consists in obeying the law.
Yeah, I understand it. I may not like it, but I understand it.
That's
right.
Now, let's turn for a moment to John Stuart Mill, who wrote the great essay on liberty in the 19th century. And here we have a different conception of liberty. And we find early in the essay this statement about freedom. "The only freedom which deserves the name is that of pursuing our own good in our own way, so long as we do not attempt to deprive others of theirs or impede their efforts to obtain it." And then later in the essay, he makes another statement which I want to read to you. "Whenever, in short, there is a definite damage or a definite risk of damage, either to an individual or to the public, the case is taken out of the province of liberty and placed in that of morality or law." Now notice, what he's saying is the very opposite of Boucher. Boucher's saying liberty consists in conformity to the law, obedience to the law, doing what the law commands. Right. And he's saying the province of liberty is the province of those actions not regulated by the law. Right. When an action conforms to the law, when you're compelled to do what the law commands because of the risk of damage or injury to others, then it's not free action. Right. Very opposite. Freedom consists in being outside the sphere of law, whereas Boucher says freedom consists in acting within the sphere of law. Right. Now, you got those two opposites. Yeah. Now, let me give you a third case. John Locke, in the essay on second treatise on civil government, I'll warn you in advance, I'm going to ask you whether Locke agrees with Boucher or agrees with Mill or holds a position somehow in between them. Locke says, "Freedom is not a liberty for everyone to do what he lists, to live as he pleases, and not to be tied by any laws. But a freedom of men under government is to have a standing rule to live by, common to everyone of that society, and made by the legislative power erected in it. A liberty to follow my own will in all things where that rule prescribes not to be subject to the inconstant, uncertain, unknown, arbitrary will of another man, as freedom of nature is to be under no other restraint but the law of nature." And just to be sure you've got the full text, let me read you one other passage. "For in all the states of created beings, capable of laws, where there is no law, there is no freedom. For liberty is to be free from restraint and violence from others, which cannot be where there is no law, and is not, as we are told, a liberty for every man to do what he lists." Now, does Locke agree with Boucher, or does he agree with Mill?
I think he agrees with both of them. Where there's a law, he agrees with Boucher, freedom consists in obeying the law. Where there is no law, where it does not apply, then a man is free to do as he chooses and wishes.
That's, I think, correct.
Yeah.
But what a complex pattern that is, but not nearly as complex as if you brought more and more authors in and saw all the ramifications on the idea of freedom.
Yeah, it's a...
But I think it's a fascinating pursuit to discover how men's opinions are related in a complex pattern of agreements and disagreements, partial agreements and partial disagreements on a given subject. And the only way you can find that out is by doing this kind of reading.
Mortimer, we should say a word about this term that we use to describe this high, challenging level of reading, syntopical reading.
It comes from the book Syntopicon, right, which exists here in 2 volumes. It was called the Syntopicon, and we call it an index of the great ideas in the great books. The word Syntopicon, of course, is a made-up word. It means a collection of topics. But let me tell you why we created this Syntopicon in the first place. when we decided to publish the great books, we thought that people would be helped to read them if they could find out what the great authors from Homer down to Freud had to say on particular subjects. That is, not just read them for pleasure, but read them to understand the pattern of differences of opinion, the agreements and disagreements among the great minds of the whole Western tradition.
The great conversation between all the authors.
Now, a conversation consists when you and I talk about the same topic. If we're talking about different topics, we're not conversing.
Right.
So we divided these things into 102 ideas and some 3,000 topics. On each of these 3,000 topics, we put down the great conversation by citing the passages in the great books which discuss that topic. Let me give you an illustration.
Are they really talking to each other?
No.
Is Aristotle really talking to...
In fact, that's what's wonderful about it. It's a kind of tour de force. It's acting as if all the great authors were assembled in one room together. We said to you, now, gentlemen and ladies, what do you think about divorce? Or what do you think about capital punishment? Or what do you think about the equality of men and women? I'm going to give you that example. Imagine now, everyone, including the writers of the Old and the New Testament, Plato, Aristotle, Homer, Shakespeare, Freud, John Stuart Mill, Locke, Hobbes. And here, one of the 3,000 topics is the differences between men and women, their equality or inequality. Now, if you were to read, take you hours to do it, of course, all the passages cited here, the remarkable thing you'd find, and I say this because I don't think most women livers know this, only two voices in the whole tradition of Western thought speak out for the equality of men and women. Plato, in the 5th century BC, says that they're completely equal and that all political offices should be equally open to both. And John Stuart Mill, 2,000 years later almost, in 1863, in a book called The Subjection of Women, again speaks out for their political and economic equality. And in between Plato and Mill, no one at all. All the opposite. Women are inferior. Women should be subjected.
Well, I don't think Dante would say that women are inferior.
You'll be surprised to find that Dante isn't quoted here.
Well, he doesn't make an explicit statement in the Divine Comedy, but clearly the exaltation of Beatrice...
Women are superior.
Women are superior.
Not equal.
Yeah. Well, as a matter of fact, I think they're all crazy because men and women are equal. They're not, neither one is superior to the other or inferior to the other in general.
You're taking sides.
Well, I think you always must, you know. A syntopical... an exercise in syntopical reading doesn't stop with the analysis of the discussion. You can lay it all out there and find out that author A says this and author B says that.
But you should do that before you do decide.
Oh, yeah. But eventually, you've got to make your own decision about it.
Obviously so.
And not only make a decision, but you've got to act on the basis of your decision.
How do you decide here?
Oh, in the case of Josephine Tay, I decided long ago that Richard III was not an evil king, that he was one of the best kings that England ever had, and that he did not kill those two little princes in the tower.
All I can say, Charles, is that I will let you know whether I agree with you after I've done my synopsis.